All right, hello, wine drinking people. Today is Tuesday, May the 3rd, and finishing up another great month here of April. We've got our review on the Mondavi vertical tasting Friday night. And, this book here that I've read almost twice now, The House of Mondavi, very fascinating book if you're into the history of Napa Valley or, just wine in general and you like Napa wines. A fantastic read and, a lot of juicy information on that. When we had Tim's daughter in here to promote Continuum, Tim Mondavi's new wine, I was telling her about the book and she just cringed because, you can't believe all that stuff in the book. And I said, look, you know what sells books? We want conflict. We want brothers punching each other. We want adultery. These are the kind of things that sell books. And the Mondavis have all of that in their life. Yes, folks. For a family that started, really much the first wave of wineries or the second wave of wineries in Napa Valley. Napa Valley's history goes back about 200 years. The very first winery in Napa Valley, Charles Krug, and that is the winery that Cesar bought for his two children, Peter and Robert, hoping that they would, be able to work together and pass it on to their kids. And, the power struggle infused, and, Robert eventually got in a fist fight with his brother Peter. These guys had differences of opinion. Robert started his own winery. They tried to cut Robert out of the family fortune, and then Robert sued them, and Robert won. It looked like the good guy. Peter looked like the bad guy, but hey, you know what? All is fair in love and war. And it's good to see that the Peter Mondavi family still owns Charles Krug Winery because the court did tell them they had to auction it off and sell it to pay off Robert. But, Robert, I guess, thought enough of his brother to not make him sell it off if he didn't have to, but he still got paid. And an interesting story, nonetheless. Robert Mondavi Winery started in 1966, and as I mentioned, that's kind of the second wave of Napa Valley. There were four big guys around the turn of the century. Beaulieu, you have Inglenook, you have Charles Krug, of course, and Behringer. And then, after that, Prohibition came, and a lot of these people didn't survive. In the 60s, I think there were only 30 wineries in Napa Valley. And then Robert Mondavi decided he was going to start his winery after he got kicked out of Krug, and the rest is history. With some money he borrowed from his friends and from a Rainier Brewing Company, he began what became the iconic Napa Valley Winery. And, it wasn't always, good times at Robert Mondavi Winery. As a matter of fact, the very first vintage of Reserve, 1974, we had a legendary vintage from Napa. And this year, the Robert Mondavi, after operating for 8 years, lost $250,000. So, Robert was never really good at expense reports or filling out anything like that, in terms of saying where the money was going or what he was spending. But he was a great promoter. He was one of the most charismatic people that you'd meet. I got to, have lunch with Robert Mondavi with a group of people, and he was in his 80s at that time, and still, very energetic. He got up, he spoke most of the time, and a really fascinating man if you have the opportunity to meet him in the wine world. And this guy could sell snow to Eskimos, man. He was a great salesman. All right, well, what about the wines? The 74 and the 78 were the two old dogs. 74 was the first year that Tim Mondavi came to the winery. This called this the test tube winery because they had some of the greatest people in Napa Valley. Warren Winarski was the first winemaker there. He went on to start his own winery, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. Their 73 Cabernet won the Tasting of Paris in 76. Okay, Mike Gergish, the next winemaker, he went on to make the 73 Chateau Montelena. That won the Paris Tasting of 1976. Third winemaker, Zelma Long, very famous winemaker in Napa Valley, and then Tim came in 74. This 74 was absolutely fantastic, and one of the things I liked it better than the 78, because the 78, another great vintage in the 70s, was balance. One of the things when wines get old, you really start to notice, the tannin edging out the fruit, the acidity edging out the fruit, and vice versa. Those three things have to be in balance in order for a wine to last a long time and still be pleasurable. And a 74 had incredible balance. This lovely red currant fruit and the cigar box spice, the cedar, and still a lovely freshness on the end. 78 similar, but it just didn't have the balance and as much fruit coming out as the 74 did. All right, next up, the 83 and 84, two so-so vintages in Napa. Hey, these wines got 82 and 85 point scores. When I was in school, that was a B. I was happy with that. But, as a reserve Cabernet from Napa Valley, 82 is an F. And, the 82-point wine, in my opinion, edged out the 85. I always say you can't drink points, but that, unfortunately, is what people judge these great wines by. And, these wines, both of them had lovely balance. The 83 to me just had a little more fruit. The 84 showing a little bit more tannin. And both of them had that lovely cedar and that dry tobacco that you got in the first older group of wines. The 1989 was up next, and 89 is not considered a very good vintage in Napa, and this is where great producers shine. This 89 had lovely, soft, velvety tannins, that red currant berry fruit still there, lovely cigar box spice to it, a classic old world Napa Valley Cab. That's one of the things that Tim Mondavi was known for is, he really promoted making wines in an old world fashion. All right, next up, the 1997, we jumped from 89 to 97, so a not so great vintage to an outstanding vintage. Some people feel the 97 may have been one of the greatest Cabernet vintages of that decade, but very forward and really starting to show in its prime right now. I think the 97 Opus 1 for me edged out the Mondavi. Oh, did I mention? We just happened to throw a few vintages of Opus in there to compare. The first couple vintages of Opus, same grapes that went into Mondavi. They just brought the winemaker for Opus, locked him into a room. Tim Mondavi and the winemaker for Mouton locked them into a room and had them create a blend. The Opus 1 winery wasn't finished until years later. And, this 97 vintage, obviously, the winery was done by that. They had some of their own vineyards, but it was still a collaborative effort and similar in style maybe to the Mondavi, because the Mondavi was an old world style Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa. But this 97 just showed a little more Brett, a little more of that animal that Opus was known for back then in the day, and even a little more concentration and richness than the Mondavi 97. All right, the 1998 Mondavi, hey, here's another off vintage that drank really well. This wine to me is at its peak right now. Really soft, velvety tannins, lovely red currant berry fruit. Again, showing some of that cigar box spice, and not so much cedar at this point, but some nice earthiness. And like I said, drinking at or near its peak, a lovely bottle of wine. You could open that with me up anytime. Hey, we've got 14 bottles left if anybody's thirsty. Okay, the 1999 vintage wines. This was a vintage that was a little bit tannic, a little bit backward when it was young, but really starting to come into its own now. The Tokelon, which is Tokelon's the name of a very famous vineyard that the Mondavis bought. Robert Mondavi bought a huge chunk of in the 60s when he bought his space for his winery. And, this is a wine they don't make every year, but they do make a single vineyard bottling Tokelon on occasion. And to me, it's one of the best wines that they make at Mondavi. Definitely a step up, I think. Even from the Opus 1 in 99, this was my favorite wine, one of my favorite wines in the tasting. It just had more length, more concentration, more depth than the other wines. The 99 Opus, again, showing some of that Brett, showing some of that animal, and maybe still a little bit tannic. All right, well, that's what I had to drink yesterday, folks. I'm your host, Andrew Lamposoni, signing off for the Wine Watch, saying remember, always drink the good stuff first.